And they were told that if they wanted to save the lives of all these various peoples who were shipwrecked in these waters, they could begin their own life-saving station down the coast. And so they did. As the years went by, the new station experienced the same changes as the old station that had occurred with them. It also evolved into another club, another life-saving station, at least on the sign. History continued to repeat itself. And if you visit that sea coast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs all along the seashore. Shipwrecks are still frequent in those waters, but most of the people drown. So I'm sure you've got the point already, but it saddens me that it's still true 40 years later. And maybe it's been true for much of Christian history, that for some reason the nature of institutions is to very soon become preoccupied with self-maintenance, self-preservation, and self-perpetuation. And this is simply the nature of the human experiment, it seems. So in light of that, something very, very new is happening that we are calling, many others are calling, the emerging church. And I tell groups that if you would go on Google right now and click the emerging church, you'd probably find 1,000 different definitions. I'm going to try as best I can to give my best understanding of what this might mean, what's unique about it, and why it offers us such hope. And I'm going to put that under 4 categories. I probably won't be able to explain them very completely, but I hope I can give you a sense. And I'm going to name them first of all. First of all, what has emerged, and I'm going to say this globally, because it hasn't just emerged in one denomination. And now, for the first time in history, as we see in this webcast, we have the opportunity to immediately learn from what's happening in Latin America, in Africa, in the Anglican Church, in the Lutheran Church, in the Pentecostal Church, in the Catholic Church, and we're all profiting from this wisdom at the same time. And the wonderful thing is that it's creating a consensus about what the gospel might really be about. But again, I'm going to give you the 4 areas. First of all, I'm going to call it an honest, broad, and ecumenical Jesus scholarship. Honest, broad, ecumenical. Not just reading what do Catholic theologians say, what do Lutheran theologians say, what are they all saying? And the amazing thing, again, is at the level of scholarship at least, there's a strong consensus emerging. Secondly, and this is sort of our work here, as you see from our name, the emergence maybe in human consciousness of a contemplative mind, a different kind of eye that is perceiving that scholarship. And it's not a dualistic mind. It's not always trying to prove that, why, now this is the right answer and that's the wrong answer. But it receives, as I call it, the whole field, and simply lets the whole field, what I understand and what I don't understand, teach me. Thirdly, this consensus has come to some conclusions that many of the major concerns of Jesus are at major variance with what most of our churches have emphasized. And we say, how did we get in this position? That Jesus said a whole bunch of things over here, and we certainly saw this in our recent election. What a lot of Christians consider the non-negotiables tend to be things Jesus never once talked about or even referred to. And you say, how do we get from here to here? And we got a consensus about this when it's rather clear that there was a different set of teachings with the founder of the firm. How did we get this far from Jesus? That is what is emerging, but not in an angry way. not in an oppositional or adversarial way, but a kind of hopeful, prayerful, desirous way. That is the new kind of Reformation that really distinguishes itself from all previous Reformations. We always felt when we came to a new discovery, we had to kick out the old guys. We had to prove that everybody ahead of us was 100% wrong, right? And we were now 100% right. We just don't have time to think that way anymore, because it's proven itself again and again and again not to be true. They were not 100% wrong, nor are we 100% right. And I'm sure my remarks today will prove that. I'll do the best I can, but based on my experience, my culture, my education, I'm sure I'm going to say things in a limited way too. It's a new kind of humility in recognizing that we all touch the great elephant, as the parable went, from a different side, but it's not the whole side. Finally, and I hope we can get time for this, what seems to be emerging, although this the most slowly, is what are the new structures, what are the new community mechanisms that can make this possible. Because we don't want to get into a new denomination. We've done that for 500 years. And we don't want to create another emerging church denomination now that is going to have to prove that it's right and all the other denominations are wrong. Again, this is a very new notion of how you reform things. So pray I can get to that. I'm going to go back now and try to illustrate these four areas. First of all, the honest and broad and ecumenical Jesus scholarship. We find that even though we have Anglican seminaries and Methodist seminaries and Catholic seminaries, up to now they largely haven't talked to one another. When we were ordained in our denomination, really all we'd been exposed to, and I'm going to use an unkind word to make the point, but it's somewhat fair, is the propaganda of our own denomination, right? Not necessarily the broad consensus. I was trained, to be honest, to be a Catholic priest, right? Not necessarily a minister of the gospel. And that's a bias that now we're willing to see and recognize. Well, it's okay to be a Catholic priest, but as my Father Francis taught us, he said our vocation was to live and to preach the life of the gospel, not primarily the life of the church. What we realize when we put church theology first, we ended up with what we have today, which is churchianity. And I don't mean that cynically, well, maybe a little bit. I don't mean that too unkindly, but we have much more churchianity than we do Christianity. And that's, suddenly we have eyes to see that. When I came out of my Catholic education, trained in this wonderful little book, and I still have a copy of it, called the Baltimore Catechism. I looked through it again this morning to make sure I wasn't making this up. This is what American Catholics were trained with in the 1950s. I was given the 6 commandments of the church. I was not taught the Sermon on the Mount. I was not taught the 8 Beatitudes. I was not taught the healing stories of Jesus, where clearly he was concerned about healing people now. Here, I was primarily taught about saving people for later. Right? That's a significant change. Significant redirection of the energy. And the vehicle for saving people for later was the church. And so, in short, what we did, in great part, we became preoccupied with the container instead of the contents, and tried to prove that we, whatever group we were a part of, was the best container. Right? I have the one holy, Catholic, and apostolic container, and much of the teaching in this book was to prove to little Catholics that very point. It's a piece of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. And when you make the piece of the whole truth, you end up with untruth, I'm afraid, because the perspective is entirely wrong. So when I was even invited in the late 1960s to go away and get a degree in Scripture, a major degree. They said, now, Richard, you know, you're going to have to get very good in Greek and very good in Latin and very good in Hebrew. And I said, well, I'm not very good in any of those already. So maybe I shouldn't go away and get a degree in Scripture. But that was the idea at that time. If you were good in languages, you would be good in Scripture. Then somewhere along the line, in fact, I'll be honest, this only hit me about 10 years ago. Jesus didn't even speak Greek. So why would knowing the exact Greek verb help you to understand Jesus? Do you understand? But that wasn't our concern, you know. In fact, he didn't even speak classic Hebrew. It was a minor dialect called Aramaic that he spoke. So none of us really had the exact words of Jesus. And all this fighting over what Jesus exactly said apparently was not even Jesus' concern. Isn't that shocking? Isn't that a little scary? If that was his concern, he would have come and did what I'm doing right now. He would have talked so it could have been recorded and no one would miss the exact word. Apparently that's not the point. It's at the energetic level, the life level, the love level that the mystery of Jesus is passed on. Not just getting the right words. The third big insight that opened up so many of us already in the 1980s was the recognition that up to that point, and this is not an exaggeration, almost all scriptural interpretation, scholarship, preaching, and teaching had been done by a very small group of people. White, overeducated, European, or North American males, right? And many of them in the Catholic tradition celibate besides. Now that's a lovely group of people. I happen to be one of them myself. But the trouble is, what would make you think that that little group would have the perfect eyes to recognize the other perspectives? And I want to just list a few of them. The feminist, womanist lens just opened up and allowed us to see things women saw that we men just never noticed. Just didn't jump out at us because we were men. We don't read the scriptures from the eyes of the lower person. We always read it from the position of power because white, educated, European and North American males, that's what we were. The lens of the poor. Translations came out in the Philippines and Latin America just so that poor, uneducated people, which something like, you know, the fishermen, could understand it and could read it and could interpret it through their set of eyes. The lens of black people, African theology. The lens of gay people. The Jewish lens, which was one of the most significant of all. I mean, I don't think we Christians realize that for some reason we assumed, stupidly, that Jesus was a Christian. How could we miss such a basic point, you know? That he wasn't a Christian. He never heard of Christianity. I'm sorry. In fact, I'd even question whether he intended it. I think he was trying to reform his Jewish religion, and in that was trying to reform all religion. So now, one of the most significant educations you can get to interpret Scripture is not to be good in Greek and Hebrew, although that helps, but in fact, cultural anthropology, which a lot of us don't even know what it means. But to understand how culture works and how you think inside of a culture and how the Jewish people were thinking and how Jesus was thinking when he said the things he said. And if you don't appreciate that Jewish culture and that first century Palestinian worldview, you miss the impact of most of the healing stories of Jesus. And you don't get the biases that he's overcoming. You don't understand the debt codes and the purity codes that he's dismissing. You don't get the shock value of his not making very much of the Jewish Sabbath. If I made the cracks about Sunday and going to Mass on Sunday that Jesus made to his Jewish friends about the Sabbath, I'd be in trouble, right? I'd be in major trouble because I'd be considered disrespectful to my Catholic religion. But what he's saying, in effect, is, Wednesday is really just as pleasing to God as Sunday, right? And God likes Tuesday too, There's really nothing automatically sacred about Sunday. And of course, Sunday isn't the Sabbath to begin with. We already changed the day. Today, Saturday, is the Jewish holy day. Finally, the lens of what I'm going to call sincere secular seekers. And I've met a number of them, actually in the last month. Educated people who weren't raised Christian. They don't have any axe to grind. They're not angry at the church. They're not on bended knee before the church. You just tell them things and they say, oh, isn't that interesting? Never thought of that before. There's a lot of these people in America today. And they are able to open the Scriptures and see things that we never saw, that we never imagined were there. It's just a new lens that isn't the churchy lens, right? It isn't the bias that we have. This is proving the 7 sacraments. That was the old Catholic thing. Everything was proving the 7 sacraments. Well, a secular seeker would never see that, And because he isn't preoccupied with proving the 7 sacraments, in fact, he sees some other things that we never saw. It's very exciting. Secondly, let's talk about what I call the new mind, the contemplative mind. I've been invited in the last years more and more to talk to Protestant denominations, to even mega churches, to what we would have called evangelical or even fundamentalist churches, who amazingly have more humility around this issue than most Catholics do. They know they were never taught the contemplative mind. They know that they lost out on the first 1,400 years of Christianity. Catholics think we have access to it, and very often we don't. So let me just try to describe a contemplative psychology, a contemplative mind, which is really just the mind that emerges when you pray instead of think first. Not against thinking. Thinking is great. But praying opens the field and moves beyond fear and judgment and agenda and analysis and just lets the moment be what it is, as it is. Now that takes training. Most of us try to pigeonhole the moment, label the moment, control the moment. You really have to be taught the contemplative mind. We now are pretty sure that it was systematically taught, mostly in the monasteries, as late as the 13th and even into the 14th century. But once we got into the oppositional mind of the Reformation, the rational mind of the Enlightenment, we just didn't have time to leave the field open. We had to prove that our analysis was correct, our culture or our nation was best, our form of education, our reading the moment was the true one. There was so much adversarial thinking that contemplative thinking pretty much fell by the wayside, even in the monasteries, even in that subgroup that was supposed to be religious life that kept the deeper and the older traditions. The wonderful thing is now it's being rediscovered across the board. And there's no select group that holds it. There's no select group that teaches it. So let me just try to describe it very briefly and certainly oversimplified. As I already alluded, it does not need to prove anything or disprove anything. It's just what the Benedictines called a lectio divina, reading of the Scripture, that looks for wisdom, that says, what does this text ask of me to change about me? not how can I use this text to prove that the Anglicans are wrong. Do you understand?